Well, I was born in the Middle West. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. My parents are from the South. My father is from North Carolina. My mother is from Chicago, Illinois. And I grew up as a teenager in Ohio. And I don't know if you know anything about Seventh day Adventists, but that is my religion, my faith. And I was sent away to boarding school in Pennsylvania, Pine Forge Academy, which is one of three black academies that still is in existence now, supported by the Seventh day Adventist Church. Um, that was my escape from Ohio. And uh, my first outlook at different cultures of the world, meeting people from all over the world who were attending the academy, from Africa, from the Bahamas, from I still have relationships with friends from Bermuda, etc. That was my first exposure. A good time for me, yes. I made the big announcement that I wanted to be in beauty and fashion. So everybody had a stroke and a heart attack. My father thought I had literally lost my mind because when I told him that I wanted to go into fashion design, um, uh, they just didn't, there was no concept of what I was interested in. So I started the process of educating them in terms of the prominent people and the people that I looked up to, etc. It didn't go very far. So I made the big announcement that I was going to go to New York City. And I had some friends. I saved up my little money and got on the train and came to New York City and stayed with relatives here in some here in New Rochelle, but in Brooklyn. And that was the beginning of my interest in fashion and beauty in New York City. My father cut off my financial support, so I had to get a job, and I started working. And I started in, classes at the City College of New York, stayed there for 2.5 years in their liberal arts classes. And a very astute teacher, in fact, an English teacher, I think in my writing and my reports, I think he sensed that I was not comfortable where I was. And he pulled me aside and said, "What do you really want to do?" I said, "Well, I really want to be in the world of fashion and beauty." He said, "Well, you're in the right place, but you're in the wrong school. He suggested the Fashion Institute of Technology. And I went for the interview and was accepted and qualified for financial support and whatever. So I gave up my apartment in Brooklyn and went into the dormitory, and the rest is history. Yeah. My sisters didn't flinch at all. They thought it was an excellent idea. They have been my rock. They have been my support. They have raised families. In fact, their siblings are jealous when we get together because we're just like this. And uh, the lean days and the difficult times, I could pick up the phone and speak to them, and there was this always the encouragement to follow my dreams and to this day I am blessed to have their interest and their encouragement and their inspiration. My parents loved me, but I was just the black sheep of the family, if I may say, at the time. And it just wasn't computing with my father. He just, you know, there's a macho image that some men see, and if you don't live up to that, there is the friction and the tension. But after he saw the successes and uh, uh, the accolades that I was getting or whatever, um, quietly he told his friends that he was very proud of what I was doing. He never told me. He told everyone else, and family, but he never told me. So I thought that was a window of success with him. I have always admired um, the beauty of African American women. Um, I didn't know how quite to address it. I went into fashion because I thought this would give me the opportunity to display my creative ability. I am not a fashion designer. Mrs. Gold was a instructor, and we were. Uh, um, she had put the muslin up as a demonstration, and she had put slits in her muslin of 3 buttonholes. Well, I thought we had leeway to be creative. I put 4 slits in the muslin and draping on the mannequin, and she looked at me and she says, "Do you understand English?" And I said, "Well, yes. And she says, "Well, 1, 2, 3. We're supposed to have 3 slits." I said, "Well, I put 4 because," she says, "Oh," she grabbed and took the muslin off of the mannequin, whatever. And I sat back. I said, "This is not going to work. This is not me. This is not going to happen." And I got up, and she said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going down to the dean and talk to the dean and see where we can make amends, whatever." She said, "Well, Mr. Fornay, you have to follow instructions." I said, "Yeah, but I'm not comfortable here." So she walked me down to the dean. At the time, it was Dean Rittenberg. He has since passed away. And he sat and he said, "You belong in the business curriculum." He said, "The business curriculum, you will have communication, you will have marketing, you will have brand, you will have fashion, design, you will have," in other words, you crossed all the disciplines. That was the best thing that happened. And in that process, the art teachers and the fashion teachers recognized that I was really looking at the aesthetics of a person in terms of body and shape and whatever. And another teacher suggested, she said, "I don't know too many black people that are prominent in the beauty industry. Have you ever thought about it?" And I said, "Well, no. So I started looking into the industry. And I don't know how I did it, but at night I worked at Mount Sinai Hospital as a switchboard operator. At the time, at Mount Sinai, they had a board where you had to actually stand up and plug in and whatever. When I tell people that, they say, "What age? Where'd you come from?" But from 12 midnight to 8 a.m. in the morning, I did that. I went from classes at 9 until about 3 in the afternoon, and then I enrolled at Wilford Academy. At night, I would go to beauty school, and I got my certificate and took my little license. So when I graduated from FIT, I was also qualified as a licensed beautician. I would like to uh, believe that I have lived an ethical life. Um, but there is implicit bias in the industry when it comes to um, especially male African American men. And when I started spreading my wings, and I was the first black uh, vice president of student council, I started writing for the papers. I started gaining some recognition, etc. So when it was time for us to start our interviews, um, my roommate was Portuguese. He was from Sacramento, California. And I had another roommate who was Japanese. He was from, he was considered to be a foreign student, and others. We were all going on the different interviews, whatever. And I won't name the companies, but we all arrived there, and Everyone got a job but me. And so I went back to the placement office and I said, what's going on? I said, I consider myself to be a good student and I worked hard and whatever. Um, and I realized that there was an issue. I didn't have blue eyes, blonde hair, I wasn't tall and thin, I didn't have an accent, and all this was playing, you know. So there was a black man, Mr. Cobb, who was uh, at the institution to help people with their problems. So I had a problem. I made an appointment. I went to see him, and he said, "You certainly are qualified to be recognized as a candidate for a job in the industry." So, long story short, he made some uh, waves with some of the faculty as to why I was not being sent on the same job interviews, etc. And so he made appointments with Clairol, with Revlon, with Helena Rubinstein, with Elizabeth Arden. Um, there was another company, L'Oreal. And he sent me to Clairol first. There's a black man, he was the first black man, Benjamin Wright. His brother was Dr. Wright at upstate New York State University as a psychiatrist. And Dr. Benjamin Wright was the first black vice president at Clairol, which was then part of Bristol Myers at the time. They're now part of Procter & Gamble. And I went straight to Mr. Wright's office. They didn't want me to go to personnel. They wanted me to visit Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright liked me, interviewed me, and he says, I want you to be the assistant ethnic marketing manager. That was the big word then. They didn't use color, black, whatever. You were ethnic. So I was hired as the assistant ethnic marketing manager. Well, they sent me to personnel. Mr. Patterson. I can call these names because he's no longer there. He looked at me and I looked at him and he said, well, he was not aware that I had had my interview with Mr. Wright. He said, Mr. Fornay, your credentials are nice, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't want to hire me. And he sent a note up to Mr. Wright's office. Mr. Wright said, Mr. Patterson, is Mr. Fornay still there? I heard him on the phone. And he says, yes. He says, I'll be down. He came down. He said, I have already hired Mr. Fornay. There's a slot for him, he says, and I'll deal with you later, And I said, oh my God, I couldn't believe what was going on. And so I went back to Mr. Patterson's office. I mean, if he could have turned all the different colors in this room, he did, And he says, well, welcome to Clairol, Mr. Fornay. I said, well, thank you very much, I went upstairs the following Monday. Mr. Patterson, the brand managers, all the top brass. Welcome to Clairol. We want you here. We have designed the situation. So that was my entree. And it was my first exposure to raw, blatant, implicit bias. And Mr. Wright was a dark-skinned man, and I had so much respect for him because for what he went through to be there, and he was intelligent, he was a bright man. I learned so much from him, and to this day I have so much respect for him and the way he handled me and the situation. And I learned from that experience that the negatives, the slights, the deliberate, uh, um, uh, uncompassionate people that you meet in life, you have to deal with it, because if you're focused, your goal is to get there and whatever, and then deal with them later. And I did deal with Mr. Patterson later. I was hired by Johnson Publishing Company. My first capacity was their training director for Fashion Fair Cosmetics. We launched their cosmetic line, and they hired me as their training director. I had never met so many beautiful black women all over this country, all over the world. I have been on every continent except Australia. And I have met black women who speak French, who speak Italian, who speak all different languages. And the problems that I thought existed in America was universal in terms of how black women were treated in terms of the textures of the hair, the different skin colorings and whatever. Um, uh, I was in the spotlight to address those issues. And I had the opportunity to inspire, to encourage black women who felt that they were less than the beauty image standard that had been set. And one thing that I had problems with in terms of speaking up with companies and personnel, um, even some of the editors, when I became beauty editor of some of the magazines, I had to let some of the people in the industry know that the American beauty industry and the European industry continue to this day to feed off the logic that black women are problematic. There's something always wrong with us. The hairline's not even, the texture of hair is, there's always the coloring of our skin, When I made up Naomi Sims years ago, they were talking about her gums being dark, And I said, well, I had some Irish friends whose gums are bloody red, and nobody had any problem with those. When I made up Imam, I was in the room when they were doing the photo, well, we called it airbrushing during those days. And they were talking about, oh, she's got this yellow pigment in the eye. I said, well, the white women that I've made up got blue pigment in their eye. I said, but that's what airbrushing does, so airbrush her eye, so it don't look like the other people. There's always a problem with us, whenever, when I was doing hair, black women's hair is so fragile, it's so thin. Every race has medium, coarse, fine hair. But when it comes to us, it becomes the problem. And so I decided that in my books and in the literature that I developed for the various companies, that I was always going to use inspirational terms, inspirational addressing of issues, etc. So the beauty advisors that we train for the various counters across the country, and I was responsible for 3,500 women at the time in terms of training them and the training associates that were in the different divisions across the company. And I told them the terminologies that we were going to use. Every black woman is beautiful until they say they're ugly. Every black woman has beautiful eyes, has beautiful lips, has beautiful skin tones. Let's talk about that. If they are not confident, then we have to build the confidence in terms of addressing those issues. And if I have anything to take away from that experience, is encouraging both in-house personnel and the customer consumer in terms of uplifting and addressing and inspiring. I feel good about that. There were some people who even called me a cookie cutter makeup artist. And because I dealt with the basics. All my books are how-to, and it's all right to be glamorous and all of this stuff, but when a woman has to get up and attend to her child and run to the babysitter and get in a car in the cities and get on the subway and whatever, she wants to know in 5 minutes how to get her face together, or 10 minutes to get her face together, or what is the products that are least expensive, etc. So that's the approach that I have taken. Most of my competitors and those that I competed with, um, uh, you know, 3 and 4 layers of makeup and step two, 1, 2, this and contouring and shading and all that's good for weddings and special occasions, whatever. And I did do classes and workshops for those kind of advanced situations. But the average woman and of the ordinary circumstances, they just want to know how to look in their prospective careers. A woman who is a supervisor at McDonald's who makes $40,000 and $50,000 a year, you do not tell her that she has to have all this stuff on when she has to work around steam tables and the atmosphere is not, you have to take all that in consideration. So I received quite a criticism. They said, "Oh, he does basic this and basic that, and whatever." But I was the one who had the big salaries. I was the one who traveled all over the world, expenses paid. I stayed in the top hotels and whatever. I had an excellent career, and I'm very proud of that. And when I meet women today, from Mavis Staples on down, and from Nancy Wilson, and from all these different people that I've made up, they all tell me that the best experience they had was reading my books, getting the information, and duplicating that in terms of being comfortable with the makeup they had. I do wish that the racial thing had been shared with me and without me having to stumble in and see it in its raw pretense. Uh, um, uh, I think they were trying to do the right thing, but I think every child should know that there is problems in terms of the culture, in terms of racial differences, etc., and how we should treat each other and how we should respect each other regardless of race. Race is an issue, and to this day, until this country addresses it, and especially the beauty industry, has not really addressed the issue. And when you speak up, of course, you're the angry black man, or you have issues, or whatever. And I don't care about that because I feel that from my experience and the people that I represent, I am obligated and to speak up and talk about the issues and concerns. And um, so I just wish that that had been shared with me early on in my experience. But I'm comfortable with the way that things have happened in my life. And I have chosen to work with black companies, the black experience, even though most of the education came from quote unquote white companies, and the training that have it's been good. But I am not stupid or to realize that I have not always been wanted or accepted. There have been slights and there have been times that I should have advanced in areas but was passed over. I'm aware of that. And I am so pleased to say that I have kept my dignity and respect in terms of addressing those issues. And people respect me for addressing the issues in a civil manner. I was at Essence Magazine as the beauty editor with Susan Taylor, and at the time, Marcia Ann Gillespie was the editor. And uh, the Sunday magazine of the New York Times had did a spread on me with Jolie Jones, Quincy Jones' daughter, and Barbara Summers, who passed away recently, who's a great author, and I forget the other young lady's name. And Mr. Johnson saw the spread, and they were getting ready to launch their Fashion Fair cosmetic line. So I got a phone call from Mr. Lance Clark, who is served as the vice president of Fashion Fair. And he introduced himself by phone and said, uh, we've been looking at you. We like what you're doing. We want you to stay in touch. And I just, there was no invitation, no anything. He just introduced himself and he said, we'll be talking, you know, just wanted to let you know who I am or whatever. Um, uh, Joyce Sample, a white woman from uh, Cleveland, Tennessee, she uh, launched a line called Libra Cosmetics. I don't know if you remember that. It's way back. But Chatham Drug and Chemical Company, which is now Chatham out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, she was one of the executives there. And she was hired as a consultant to Johnson Publishing Company in terms of helping them establish their cosmetic line. But she was head of Libra. So she asked me, would I want to work part-time with the line, you know. So they flew me at the time Hudson's Department Store, which is no longer in existence in Detroit, Michigan. And that was my first exposure being in the arena of a department store. And she introduced me to all the big wigs, and I met Mr. Neiman Marcus, uh, and this is my little introduction to that little world. And didn't know that I was being looked at, you know. And so I did the little counter things and the training and whatever. And then she called one summer. Uh, I was looking for summer work. She said, well, Mr. Johnson wants to see you in Chicago. So I went to Susan. I said, Susan, I have gotten an offer from uh, uh, Fashion Fair. They're getting, she said, yeah, I heard about that. And I think I better look into this. She said, oh, by all means, Mr. Johnson, oh, you know. So they flew me to Chicago, put me up in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, had a car pick me up and bring me to the Johnson Publishing Building. Now, you asked me what was my accomplishment. I thought I had arrived just in that little circumstance, you know. And they took me there. He interviewed me. It was a very difficult interview. He, someone had told him that the glamour part of makeup was the way to go in terms of whatever. So he was asking me, have you made up any celebrities? Well, these were low, you know, average. They weren't the big time people at the time. And I mentioned a few people. And he said, well, what is your strategy? What is your concept? What is whatever? So I told him, I said, most women want this and career women, whatever. He said, well, what about the hoes and the prostitutes? You know, I almost fell on the floor. I couldn't believe this man had said, he said, well, you know, they buy makeup too, you know. And I said, well, yes. I said, well, I probably made up someone was not aware of it. I said, but I'm not against anyone. I said, it's about sales or whatever. I had to dig my way out of that, you know, because he just threw me on. And I was told that he deliberately does this to see how you respond and whatever, you know. They hired me. and I made up hoes and prostitutes and everybody else, to make to make the sales quotas that were given to me, and that was the beginning. Uh, Really meeting him was one of the highlights in my career. I was dedicated to my career. I was always on the road. There were times I would go for months just traveling from city to city, whatever, and didn't realize that you were cutting off family, birthdays, Thanksgiving. You make those kind of sacrifices, and I had the nieces and nephew who were born. I didn't see them until they were 2 and 3 years old, and whatever. And this is all part of your life in terms of how you live and how you feel about yourself. Um, that was a real sacrifice, and not establishing. You would come home and you'd be home, but you still had to think about packing up and going on the next trip and whatever. Yes, I enjoyed it. It was thrilling, etc. But now I really appreciate sitting at home looking out my window and seeing the stars and the moon and the sunset and whatever that have been taken for granted for years. That was a sacrifice. If you are going to be creative, and if you are going to consider uh, the evolution of color and fashion and trends, etc., you have to look at everyone. You have to be open, and uh, you have to move your personal um, biases out of the way, and you have to address issues as they come. A person who doesn't read doesn't understand what life is all about. You have to open a book. Regardless of how much you know, there's always the opportunity to learn and build more. My confidence has been built and developed because of the education and the experience that I have. I don't feel intimidated by anyone. And I don't mean to sound arrogant, but I am focused, I know what I want, and I think I have intelligently gone about trying to develop the road that I want to go down. But you have to go to art collections, you have to go to galleries, you have to go to outings. People watching is the best experience. You just have to be open and listen and look and learn. I want people to feel that I live a life of inspiration. I want people to say, Mr. Fornay tried to make a difference in the beauty industry in terms of setting the African American woman in particular on a pedestal that wasn't there before. And not to be worshiped, but to be appreciated and respected for her beauty. Not to be overly concerned of the size of her nose and the fullness of her lips and the textures of her hair and whatever. I see beauty in every person. Now, one thing that Naomi Sims said, that uh, um, an unattractive woman makes herself ugly. She sees ugly in a person who is not confident, who doesn't respect herself, and whatever. And I buy into that philosophy, because if you don't respect yourself, like Eleanor Roosevelt said, which is one of my favorite quotes, if you don't respect yourself, no one else is going to respect you. And I had to learn that for myself in terms of gaining respect. You have to respect yourself. And you have to bring a certain air of dignity, and it's okay to be ordinary, but there should be a class about yourself in terms of who you are and how you feel about yourself. So I want people to think good of me in terms of trying to make a difference in the world of beauty and fashion.